My name is Emily Depew, and I am a member of the Dole Institute Student Advisory Board, the official student group of the Institute. Welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics, and thank you for attending today's program presented by the Department of Military History at the Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth. The Dole Institute would like to hear from you about today's program. Please let us know your feedback by contacting us on social media or via email at doleinstitute@ku.edu. To view past programs, visit our online video archive at www.doleinstitute.org. A video of today's presentation will be available on our website soon. We'd like to encourage each of you to consider becoming friends of the Dole Institute. Our friends help keep our programs free and open and support archive research and our student activities. Please contact us if you're interested. After the presentation, we'll be having some time for the audience to ask questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand and a student worker with a microphone will come to you. Please stand if you're able and ask just one brief question. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you to please turn off your cell phones. And now please join me in welcoming Director of Department of Military History at the Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, Dave Cotter.
Thank you, everybody, and it's great to be back again and to see a lot of familiar faces. We very much appreciate your patronage at these events that we very much enjoy participating in. Today it's my privilege to introduce to you one of the absolute best members of our department, Professor John Kuhn. John's a retired naval officer and has served at the Staff College for close to 2 decades. His academic excellence has been recognized by a number of different institutions, especially at the Command and General Staff College, where he served as the Major General Stoft Chair for Military History. Has recently been honored by the Naval War College by being named as the Admiral King Chair for Naval Warfare. So he'll serve a year at Newport as a visiting professor there. His most recent book is about America's first General Staff, and it's about the United States Navy Board. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor John Kuhn.
Thanks so much, Dave. I appreciate that. Okay, pretty loud. Yeah, I see a couple familiar faces out there, some former professors and everything, and thank you so much for having me. Hey, let's get right to the topic so that we can get right there. You know, one of the things that happens with Jack Fletcher is that people go, well, people who have sort of more than a passing familiarity with the history of World War II in the Pacific have heard of the destroyer class USS Fletcher. And the assumption is that it's named after this guy. But the Navy actually names ships and ship classes after Navy families. So the USS Wainwright is not named after one Wainwright, it's named after about 6 different Wainwrights who served in the United States Navy between the Civil War and World War II. And the same thing is true of the Fletcher class. The Fletcher family was a Navy family. And as you'll learn here, Fletcher wasn't the first guy. His uncle was actually in command of the U.S. fleet, the entire U.S. fleet, in the intervention in Mexico in 1914, in the Wilson administration. So the destroyer class was actually named after the family, and it actually came out during World War II. It was already in the works to be produced before some of the victories that are associated with Fletcher's name occurred. So that's just sort of an interesting tidbit to start things out with. Well, that's a great picture of Jack Fletcher because it helps us understand the answer to our question, okay? So what if Great Britain forgot Nelson? Would never happen, would it? Horatio Nelson wins the greatest victory in British naval history. Of course you're not going to forget him. And then there's all these other battles that he won, the Nile and Copenhagen and his coming out at St. Vincent's and all these other places. So, it would be as if Great Britain forgot Nelson. Not quite, okay? Not quite. When you think about it, at the time Fletcher was beginning to serve in the Navy, there was a guy who was like that, who was sort of the American Nelson. His name was Admiral George Dewey, the only admiral of the U.S. Navy in Navy history. He's not a fleet admiral, but he is admiral of the U.S. Navy. Some people call it the only six-star admiral. So maybe George Dewey, but even George Dewey's been forgotten to some extent, which kind of shows you the difference between the United States, perhaps, and Great Britain. And that little ... would it be like that? Well, I don't think it would be, because Fletcher's an interesting guy. He's the forgotten admiral. But here's why it's always bothered me about Fletcher. It's always bothered me about Fletcher. So he's the only admiral on active duty at the time World War II starts with both the Medal of Honor and the Navy Cross. So he's the most decorated in terms of seniority of awards admiral on active duty in the United States Navy when World War II breaks out. Now, there's some caveats to that, and we might get into some of them when we go into his background. He wins the first victory. I characterize it as an operational victory in the Pacific War, in World War II in the Pacific against the Japanese. He's the first guy to kind of win a victory. He's in command when that happens. He's the senior officer present afloat and something that we call the officer in tactical command, and that's Frank Jack Fletcher. Not a brown shoe admiral, but a black shoe admiral, a surface warfare admiral, okay, a cruiser guy. So he wins that first victory. That's a pretty big deal. You'd think we might remember him. He's also in command at Midway. At least at the beginning, he's in command. Nimitz puts him in charge. All right? Nimitz puts him in charge. He's actually very highly thought of at the time, and that's a key thing. Fletcher is actually very highly thought of at the time these things are taking place. And the forgetting is a process that actually starts sort of while he's in command during these victories. But he's in command at Midway, and so he's the guy who should get the credit for that victory. The three of the four Japanese aircraft carriers that were sunk while Fletcher was in command, not while Spruance was in command. Okay? And so why is he forgotten? Well, let's answer that question. This is going to be fun. All right, bottom line up front. He's not a self-promoter. He's a quiet, unassuming guy. He doesn't match that idea of the impossible, loud, brash naval hero that Nelson is. This self-promoter, this guy who's always kind of making sure he's mentioned in dispatches. That's not Frank Jack Fletcher, okay? He's sort of an inside operator, right? He knows how the Navy works. He works in the Bureau of Personnel, or the Bureau of Navigation as it was at the time. He's a DC guy, so he knows how things work. He's a graduate of both the Senior War College of the Army and the Senior War College for the Navy. So he's gone to both the Army War College and the Navy War College senior courses. So he kind of knows how things work, all right? The second piece is jealousy. Those medals that he gets, one of them prior to World War I and one of them during World War I, they're a cause for jealousy by people who think they're better than him. All right? Why, he doesn't deserve that. He only got that because. And so we'll kind of look at that. And then there's other sorts of jealousies, which is like, well, why should he get all the credit for the Coral Sea? Or why should he get all the credit for Midway, right? So there's a lot of professional jealousy that plays a role in what happens to this guy. He's not the right kind of admiral to command aircraft carriers. He's a cruiser guy. He's a surface warfare officer. At the beginning on Pearl Harbor Day, as we'll see, he's in command of a screen for an aircraft carrier. He's not even in command of the whole aircraft carrier group. He's been trained in carrier operations at the Naval War College, as were all naval officers who'd gone to the Naval War College. But he's not seen as being an aviator. Only it's that Billy Mitchell bias. Only aviators can command aviation units, even big ones, all right? He never wrote self-serving memoirs, and he never hired anybody to write self-serving memoirs, all right? Okay? Or he was never considered worthy of a hagiographic biography. He ticked off a Harvard Don. Never piss off the East Coast establishment, especially in the 1940s, because they're running the country, all right? Okay? So he actually ticks off a Harvard Don. We'll talk about that guy. And then after the war, there is an active campaign some people might call it a conspiracy, all right, to write him out of the history of World War II and to marginalize as much as possible any role he played in anything good that happened and expand and emphasize anything where it could be assumed that he did poorly in terms of command and his performance, okay? So that's the bottom line up front. That's my answer as to why he's forgotten. So he's from the Midwest, Iowa, not far away. He goes to the United States Naval Academy, as all naval officers pretty much did back then. He's from a Navy family, okay? So he's a legacy guy, right? He's a legacy guy. His classmates included some rather interesting people. John Towers, Naval Aviator number 3, okay? John McCain, grandfather to Senator McCain, who just recently passed away, and father to the Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet during the Vietnam War, Jack McCain, and commander of Task Force 38, which consisted of 17 aircraft carriers and their escorts during the Pacific War. So John McCain, Slew McCain, one of the original naval aviators who said they called him a Johnny-come-lately because he got qualified as an aviator when he was a captain. Robert Gormley, a name you don't hear much, okay, was also his. We'll talk about Gormley. Aubrey Fitch, an entire ship is named after Aubrey Fitch, a Perry-class frigate, and some destroyers have been named after Aubrey Fitch. So these are some of the names. And if you're a naval historian, these are big names, okay? They were part of his classmates in the class of 06. Well, let's talk about the war hero. He earns the Medal of Honor in Mexico. Now, so he's, this is not unusual to have your nephew, Lieutenant Fletcher, accompany you on the flagship to a war somewhere. You haven't had one since the Spanish-American War. Hey, let's get Junior, let's get Frank Jack to serve with Admiral Frank Friday Fletcher, who's the Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Fleet, and let's take him to this thing going on down in Mexico. And what happens is Fletcher, his uncle sends him ashore to help evacuate American citizens, and he's on a train with a bunch of American citizens, and he actually performs heroic actions in getting these people all the way to Veracruz and evacuated from Mexico, including kind of protecting them from bandidos, all right, who try to stop the train and take the American citizens off the train. And Fletcher actually, and in the citation, it talks about that. But that medal is always sort of colored funny, because they're like, well, that was the only medal they had back then, so they gave him out like candy. Or it was his uncle, it was nepotism. The thing about it is he doesn't go around kind of talking about it much. It's there on his uniform, and if you ask him about it, he'll say, yeah, I got that in Mexico. But he's not a guy who walks around like saying, hey, let me tell you about my Medal of Honor, all right? So real quiet kind of. And again, when you read the circumstances surrounding the medal, it's pretty crazy stuff. Yeah, he's not out in the fleet. He's ashore, helping evacuate people during what's essentially a humanitarian assistance operation. So when World War I starts, we don't have any anti-submarine warfare ships to help, but we commission all kinds of rust buckets, yachts, sloops, and he actually takes command of an ex-yacht and begins to do anti-submarine warfare patrol, and he actually ends up sort of in command as a lieutenant commander of something called the Suicide Fleet, because people said it'd be suicide to sell this group of anti-submarine warfare ships across the Atlantic at this time of the year to go help the British with the anti-submarine warfare effort, but he does. One of the things that Fletcher's always very well known for, and it sort of explains some things that we're going to talk about, is his flawless seamanship. He was a fantastic seaman. He and Nelson had that in common, all right? And then while he's commanding a destroyer in World War I, so it makes sense that a destroyer would in part be named after him, he earns the Navy Cross for helping with convoy duty and anti-submarine warfare duty. So he actually wins the Navy Cross. Now, he's criticized for that award as well, because they said, well, everybody got a Navy Cross, And so he didn't really deserve that because they gave that, but not everybody got a Navy Cross, and not everybody commanded a destroyer in the North Atlantic. Now, commanding a destroyer in the North Atlantic is not like commanding a destroyer in the North Atlantic today. Today, a destroyer is about a 10,000, 15,000 ton ship. Okay? Back then, we're talking 1,500 tons, 2,000 tons. The thing's like a little bobber in the North Atlantic. Anybody ever sailed the North Atlantic? Yeah, I have. And has anybody ever sailed the North Atlantic in an older class destroyer? I have. Okay, it's not easy to do that. So I can appreciate just maintaining station on these convoys in the bad seas. So I suspect he probably deserved the Navy Cross, all right? In the interwar years, he did something we call climbing the fleet ladder. He kind of punched all the right tickets, all right? His uncle was sort of his sea daddy. He sort of looked out for Jack to make sure that he got the right assignments. Oh, by the way, Nelson's uncle did the same thing for Nelson, Morris Suckling. But we always forget that, right? But his uncle's retired. He actually commands the submarine base at Cavite Bay, or at Cavite in Manila Bay, all right? So he's actually got command of a non-surface ship unit, a submarine base in Cavite. Again, he attended Navy and Army War College senior courses, one of the few officers to do that. He was chief of staff to the Asiatic fleet during the Manchurian crisis. That's when the Japanese invaded Manchuria and all the gunboats got into all the trouble on all the rivers, the Yellow River, the Yangtze. In other words, he's the chief of staff to the guys who are running the sand pebbles around, all right? So he's got broad experience. He takes command of the USS New Mexico. This was the same battleship commanded by William Moffett, the founder of naval aviation, and the ship does superlatively. It's awarded the best ship in the Atlantic Fleet 2 years in a row, and it gets all the battle efficiency awards. Of course, it helps that the engineering spaces get these battle efficiency awards because the chief engineering officer is this little lieutenant commander named Hyman Rickover. Okay? But I suspect Fletcher knew when he had a good deal going, and he knew how to get the most out of Hyman Rickover. Anyway, so he had a really good thing. He's considered a Washington repeater. In other words, in the interwar period, Ernest King, who eventually kind of becomes commander-in-chief of the global navy in World War II, the most powerful admiral that's ever floated the seven seas, except he kind of stayed in Washington for the most part, not on the ships. But King says, I don't want these Washington these guys that keep coming back to Washington I don't like them because, they're political operators. So he's sort of tarnished a little bit because he does 2 tours in Washington, one with the Bureau of Navigation, which is personnel, and one with the Bureau of Ordnance, which is sometimes called the Gun Club. So he's also a member of the Gun Club, these stodgy admirals that are against innovation and everything. And there's a narrative about that, when in fact he's not. He's a sophisticated operator. He knows how to take care of programs. He knows how to organize personnel. But he does have that stain on his record as far as Admiral King is concerned, all right? He's a protege. He and Chester Nimitz are both proteges of the Navy's up-and-coming Admiral J.O. Richardson. And Richardson takes command of the Pacific Fleet. And it's Richardson who sort of takes care of these 2 guys. What's the problem with that? Richardson is fired by FDR when, after 1940, FDR says we're going to keep the Pacific Fleet in Pearl Harbor. Pacific Fleet was based up until 1940 in San Diego. FDR says we're going to put it in Pearl Harbor, and we're going to leave it there as a signal to the Japanese that we mean business about their illegal war in China, right? And Richardson stands up to the president and says, this is not a good idea. We don't have the facilities here to support the fleet. You're going to have to put a lot of work into this place before we can forward base the fleet here. We should move them back into San Diego. Yes, build up the base, but not until it's ready for the fleet. And oh, by the way, I think the fleet is vulnerable here to a surprise attack, all right? And FDR fires him, all right? So he's also got this sort of shadow over his career, both he and Nimitz, of having, been proteges of Richardson. So they sort of had the wrong guy that was their sea daddy. He does very well in the famous fleet exercises, very, very solid performance, but his specialty is screening operations and reconnaissance. That's his specialty. That's what he's considered good at. When Pearl Harbor takes place, he's the commander of a cruiser force in the Pacific Fleet. He's a relatively new rear admiral. He's 56 years old. 33 of those 56 years, over 2/3 of his life, he's been in the U.S. Navy, okay? So a relatively older guy, right? And there was some like, hey, let's get these old guys out of the way and make room for the young guys. Unless your name is Ernest King, right? And then don't get rid of the old guys. Keep the old guys, all right? His subordinates in the cruiser force were these two guys called Raymond Spruance and Thomas Kincaid. So they're both his subordinates. He's senior to them. He's a pretty senior admiral, all right, when Pearl Harbor happens. He is with the Midway Reinforcement Force when Pearl Harbor happens. That's a carrier group that is carrying airplanes and supplies to Midway to beef it up in case of a Japanese surprise attack. So that's why he's not in port when Pearl Harbor happens. He doesn't get brushed with that brush of shame that, hey, what did you do when you were at Pearl Harbor and the Japanese surprised you? He's actually out on operations in command of the cruiser screen. Well, there's our geography. So here's Hawaii, there's Oahu, there's Midway, Wake Island, and we're going to spend a lot of time down here. Well, maybe not a lot of time, but we're going to spend, because that's where he first sort of comes to the attention of everybody as a commander, as a successful operational commander in World War II, and it's also where we might conceivably argue that his career ends as a commander, as an operational commander. So that's the geography. There's the overall commander, another J.O. Richardson. So when Husband Kimmel, who's not a Richardson guy, is I think he's a Stark guy or a Leahy guy. When Admiral Husband Kimmel is relieved of command and Nimitz is tapped to take command of the Pacific Fleet, this is a guy who is sort of in Fletcher's camp. Initially, he's very protective of Fletcher. Nimitz is not an aviator, okay? He's actually a black shoe / submariner. He's both. And the Navy had a lot of that, officers who were qualified in one or more warfare areas. It was pretty common back then because they all started out as black shoes, right? And then some of them became aviators, brown shoes, and some of them became submariners, all right? And Nimitz was one of these guys. And Nimitz's big thing prior to the war that anybody kind of knew anything about Nimitz was he was an expert in personnel policies. He had almost lost his career because he wasn't that great of a seaman. Fletcher was regarded as a much better seaman than Nimitz in a collision that he had. And Nimitz actually went before the Board of Inquiry and received a bad report card. But he wasn't discharged from the Navy, and that shows you what zero tolerance can do. It can keep Chester Nimitz from being the right man in the right time in the right place in the Pacific War. But he's Fletcher's boss. The problem with Nimitz is he's not going to be allowed to choose the guys he wants initially. Ernest King is mostly going to choose those guys in concert with the Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox, and Franklin Roosevelt. That's how much they micromanaged who was in command of the Pacific after Pearl Harbor. It's really those three guys, FDR, Frank Knox, and Ernest King. And Nimitz will say, well, I think, and they go, no, we've already made the decision, Chet, just chill out, right? So both Nimitz and Fletcher are sort of, they're sort of under a cloud. They have to prove themselves. The first thing that comes up, and again, this seems chronological, but it doesn't. It seems like it's something that, oh, here we go. We should have known Fletcher was a loser, and we should have forgotten him and not let him command ever because of this thing called the Wake Relief Task Force. So Fletcher is actually there. It's supposed to be commanded by Halsey. Halsey actually gets sent south in the Pacific, and so as Wake Island is being attacked for a second time by the Japanese, Fletcher is put in command of the task group to go relieve them. And Aubrey Fitch is his subordinate in command of the aircraft carrier, part of the task force. And here's where Fletcher's seamanship comes in. He's got to refuel his destroyers. A Japanese destroyer attacks and damages the Saratoga, which takes her out of the war for like the first 6 months of the war. All right? So these waters are believed to be submarine infested. All right? So Fletcher says, well, I got to make sure my destroyers come with us all the way. And on top of it, there's bad weather. I love it when the critics of Fletcher that say, well, he was too busy refueling his destroyers to get on down the line and get over there. And it's always the amateurs that have never refueled or done this kind of thing and done the logistics at sea who criticize this thing, particularly in poor weather. It's also the slowest oiler in the fleet that's with the Wake Relief Task Force. So by the time they get within about 250 miles of Wake, the Japanese are actually accepting the surrender, and Admiral Pye, who's the acting Pacific commander, recalls Fletcher. Pye is crucified for this. Pye is one of the authors of War Plan Orange, a guy who should be celebrated for that fact in the interwar period. But because he recalls the Wake Task Force, he's regarded as cautious and a loser, and he's actually out of a job, all right? And so William Pye takes the fall. But after the war, the historians will start to look backward and go, well, here we should have known that Fletcher was cautious. One in particular will take this and start a narrative of Fletcher's too cautious, he's always refueling. So that's when the fueling narrative begins, and I got that up on the bullet. After that, he goes to do Pacific operations in the South Pacific on the Yorktown. It's during these operations that he sort of, the cautious side of the myth begins. So the first part of the myth, and a myth is one of these narratives that takes hold and never lets go, right? But it's based on flimsy or non-existent or manufactured evidence in many cases. So right now, he's the guy who spends too much time making sure his destroyers have fuel to protect against submarines, which are infesting the area, which now we know after the fact they were. The Japanese had something on the order of 30 submarines east of the international date line looking for aircraft carriers to sink at this time, right? So, but it's during these South Pacific operations that Fletcher's on the Yorktown and they're doing carrier raids. Initially, they raid the Gilberts, but there's a particular operation that he's asked to do. The people asking to do it are either in Washington, like King, or they're elsewhere. And so when Fletcher looks around and goes, well, you know, what do you want me to attack? There's nothing to attack. The enemy reports, which were false, made it back to Washington, but they never made it to Fletcher, and they were false to begin with. But this whole idea emerges Fletcher's a little too cautious. In another case, there was a target they wanted Fletcher to attack, and Fletcher didn't attack it because he said there were no targets there. That's because there was no bomb damage assessment for the previous attack. If they'd done that, they would have found that there were no targets there. And Fletcher was really concerned that the Japanese air forces that were beginning to build up in the South Pacific, particularly on the island of New Guinea and on the island of Rabaul, would make mincemeat out of his guys if he pressed in too close to land and tried to attack targets that weren't there. Okay? So subsequent history has said, hey, in this case, caution was warranted by Fletcher. But the caution myth starts. And now guys like King and Nimitz are starting to go, well, maybe Fletcher is cautious. All right? So in March, he joins Task Force 11 under Admiral Brown. Admiral Brown's another guy who's commanding carriers. So Fletcher's a black shoe admiral in command of a carrier force. All right? Why? He's the senior guy. That's how the Navy worked at that time. Hey, you're senior, you get operational command. We're not like the Air Force. We believe naval officers are generalists and they can command operational forces. So he's on this raid in March against Lae and Salamua, which are in New Guinea, right? And this is sort of the first time that the Imperial Japanese Navy aircraft receive large losses in contact with the U.S. fleet. Of course, he's not directly in command. He's actually under Admiral Brown. And at the same time this is going on, so Brown kind of gets the credit for this, and then Brown gets sent back to Pearl to do something else, and Fletcher takes command again, all right? So at the same time in the United States, the Secretary of the Navy and Admiral King say, hey, you know, we need to rank all these admirals we have and figure out who's good and who's bad. They rank all the admirals, and Fletcher is ranked higher than Nimitz in the rankings, okay? And King is one of the voting members. Not even ranked is Raymond Spruance, but he's ranked higher. The only guys that are actually ranked higher than, and King includes himself in the list, and he's also a voting member. Little conflict of interest there. The only guys ranked higher than Fletcher are Robert Gormley, Chester Nimitz is lower than he is, Admiral King, I think Admiral Leahy, all right, and Admiral Stark. All of those admirals that I just mentioned, with the exception of Gormley, are 4-star admirals, all right? So Fletcher's actually one of the highest ranked admirals based on his contemporaries' view of him, right? So he's actually fairly highly thought of. All these bad things that he's doing to change everybody's mind about him, they haven't really taken place, all right? Yeah, there's some concerns, but there's concerns about Nimitz, too. In fact, John Lundstrom, in his wonderful book on Fletcher, says Nimitz is almost in more danger of being fired than Fletcher is at this point. Nobody's even thinking of firing Fletcher. But Nimitz, they're actually thinking of relieving Nimitz, thinking maybe he's not the right guy for the job. What happens is when Fletcher finally takes over the single aircraft carrier in the South Pacific during the time of the Doolittle raid in March and April, a report comes back to King that Fletcher didn't attack Japanese ships. Again, King has incorrect intelligence. Fletcher has a better understanding. He's the man on the scene. Turns out those targets weren't there. But King, who had just a couple days before ranked Fletcher very high, actually sends a really nasty message to Fletcher saying, hey, why weren't you more aggressive in going after these ships that didn't exist? All right. Now, King didn't know they didn't exist, but Fletcher did. All right. So the Coral Sea. Let's go forward here. So the Coral Sea is down here. The first big Japanese operation after the Doolittle raid is an attack through the Coral Sea with an invasion fleet to come around here and seize Port Moresby in New Guinea. And that way the Japanese will extend their sea and air umbrella towards cutting this sea line of communication with the United States and with the lines that are supporting Australia. So Fletcher's in command at this battle, right? And we'll go back here. I wanted to show you where it was. He's in tactical command. He's got 2 aircraft carriers, the Yorktown and the Lexington. So he's in command of the first 2 aircraft carriers in combat with the Japanese Navy in the war, okay? Now, he's actually embarked on the Yorktown, right? But the Lexington gets sunk, all right? However, we sink a Japanese light carrier, the Shoho, and also we shoot down an entire Japanese air wing that's based on one of their carriers, and we damage a 3rd Japanese aircraft carrier. So in this one battle, the Japanese subtract 1 aircraft carrier from the U.S. order of battle, and the U.S. subtracts 3 Japanese aircraft carriers from the Japanese order of battle temporarily. 1 permanently because it's sunk, 1 a little bit longer because it's damaged, and then 1 because there's no airplanes to fly on it. Okay? The Japanese aren't like the Americans where they can kind of plug in a new air wing. They only have 1 air wing with 1 ship, and if that air wing gets attrited, that ship doesn't sail. They have to come up with a new air wing and train new pilots. All right, and it takes them about a year and a half to 2 years to train all those new pilots. So the Japanese actually abandoned the invasion of Port Moresby. It's the first operational defeat of the Japanese in the Pacific War. It's the first setback, and Fletcher's in tactical command. Well, King had commanded the Lexington, so he's a little pissed because Fletcher manages to lose an aircraft carrier, and so instead of kind of thinking of it as a victory, he says, well, we lost an aircraft carrier and we shouldn't have. Fletcher and his team learn. One of the things they learn is that this air power theory of mass everything and send it to hit the target doesn't work at sea. You've always got to keep a reserve. Because if you go and you hit the wrong target, like a light carrier instead of a heavy carrier, now you don't have any Schlitz, all right, to hit the right target. And now, and they also learn, hey, we need to generate more combat air patrol when we are striking another carrier. So we need to hold something back. We also need to separate our carriers and not keep them so close together, all right? So Fletcher also learns that. So he learns. The other thing here, and this hurts Fletcher, but it helps the United States, light command touch. He's not a micromanager. He practices something that the Army loves to talk about, mission command. He actually practices it, but he'll be criticized for that style of command by his superiors. Not by Nimitz, but by King. Hey, you should have done this. You should have been in so-and-so's. And Fletcher was like, no, I think we got the job done. I think my command style is just right. Well, that brings us to Midway, all right? And this is the battle that should have cemented Fletcher as one of the major heroes of World War II. But again, remember all those things I said about him, all right? So again, let's kind of just review it real quick so we can move on here. I'm just going to press some things. So this is the Japanese plan. The Japanese plan is to attack Midway, draw out the only two aircraft carriers that they think the United States have, all right, and then ambush those aircraft carriers with a Japanese 4 aircraft carrier force called Kido Butai. They'll pick those carriers up with submarines, all right, and that's their plan, all right. Then they'll invade the Hawaiian Islands if they successfully invade Midway. And the Japanese, the plan is kind of screwy because it's got all these moving parts. There's another pretty healthy aircraft carrier group, hundreds and hundreds of miles up here to the north, days and days steaming away, all right? And so these forces are scattered over the Pacific. And so they're ripe for defeat in detail if the Japanese assumptions that they'll surprise the Americans and that the Americans only have 2 aircraft carrier are correct, all right? Well, Fletcher's Yorktown goes into Pearl Harbor, and again, logistics wins the battle. They get the Yorktown out there, get it with the Enterprise and the Hornet. Fletcher will organize this force not as 4 carriers in a box pattern, but 2 aircraft carriers loosely over here and 1 aircraft carrier loosely over here. If you find one group, you're not going to find the other group. So Nimitz leaves it to Fletcher to come up with that disposition, all right? And Fletcher adopts it based on his experience at the Coral Sea. And what does it lead to? This is what it leads to. So these are Nimitz's instructions to Fletcher. Okay, so we're worried this guy is cautious, so let's give him this advice, right? So they're not worried he's cautious. In fact, they're worried he might be not cautious enough, all right? Calculated risk. You shall mean avoid exposure of your forces to attack by superior enemy forces without good prospect of inflicting as a result greater damage to the enemy. And this is sort of Nimitz's standing orders to Fletcher when he's in command at these battles. We've got 2 more to go and we'll be done. So here's what the Japanese expected. They're going to have a decisive battle and the war's going to be won in one day. This is what they got. They got ambushed by U.S. military aviation under the command of Jack Fletcher. Again, the first 3 Japanese aircraft carriers are sunk on Fletcher's watch whilst he's in command. The Japanese conduct a retaliatory strike against the Yorktown. The Yorktown is badly damaged and taken under tow by a destroyer. Fletcher calls up Raymond Spruance and says, I pass command to you. Go sink that final Japanese aircraft carrier. They hear you. And Spruance does, okay? So, but Spruance, after the war, is made the hero of this battle, not Fletcher, all right? And so Raymond Spruance, even though he's under Fletcher's command, by the way, one of Spruance's carriers, the Hornet, never finds the Japanese fleet with its dive bombers. It does with its torpedo bombers, but how much damage do the torpedo bombers do to the Japanese carriers at Midway? None, all right? So it's only the Enterprise dive bombers and then the entire Yorktown Air Wing, which includes Butch O'Hare, that finds the Japanese fleet, okay? Fletcher's Yorktown group actually sinks the carrier Soryu, all right? And one reason they don't attack the other carriers is, one, nobody can find the Hiryu because it's hiding inside a rain squall, which is what carriers do all the time. I'm a carrier guy. We used to hide in rain squalls all the time. Good place to hide, all right? And but the other 2 carriers, the Kage and Akagi, are already on fire, and so the commander of the air group from the Yorktown that's attacking says, hey, we'll just make sure that the Soryu goes down. There's no need for us to attack these other 2 carriers. But the overall operational construct is Fletcher's, and again, he has a very light touch in command. He has a very light touch. He does criticize Spruance after the battle in his fitness report. He writes Spruance's fitness report saying, hey, you might have monitored what the Hornet was doing a little closer, all right? And that will be held against him by Spruance eventually after the war, the fact that he doesn't give him a glowing fitness report for not commanding a little bit more aggressively with the Hornet, which is under the command of Mark Mitcher. He's the captain. Well, Fletcher's in tactical command. A Japanese submarine comes up on the slow Yorktown and sinks it. But three are done. So light touch, we talked about that. The Japanese abandoned the invasion of Midway, biggest U.S. Naval victory in history, supposedly. And Fletcher and his team, to include Ray Spruance, learn. All right? And then he gets sent out again. All right? So nobody removes this guy from command. Nobody criticizes. You don't see anything. But he's not getting any credit either. He's not calling in. One of the things that happens to Jack Fletcher when he comes back to Pearl Harbor is, again, here's a guy who's basically been on duty since Pearl Harbor at sea on aircraft carriers for 7 months. Okay? I looked at the amount of time. In that 7 months, he probably spent about 4 weeks of it ashore. The rest of the time he's embarked. All right? In operations that are high stress and that are unending, and eventually in the South Pacific they're eating canned spinach and water. That's what they're eating, because King says, well, as long as they've got canned spinach they can stay on station. All right, and so he comes back into Pearl Harbor pretty tired. He's won these 2 big naval victories, and Nimitz and Spruance and King are all sort of taking credit for it. Well, not Spruance. He lets others give him the credit. He's a pretty humble guy, to be honest. But he comes in, he writes his fitness report for Spruance and some of his other commanders in the battle, and then he's told by somebody, hey, Admiral, there's this guy who wants to talk to you. His name is Samuel Eliot Morrison. Well, he's already gotten orders from Nimitz to proceed south at best possible speed to be in charge of Operation Watchtower Task 1. You guys know that as the Guadalcanal campaign. So Spruance only has a couple days before he gets sent to the South Pacific, actually on a PBY. So he actually goes down there via PBY and then embarks the carrier from Noumea. So Noumea's down here. Okay. So he tells him, listen, I'm tired, I need some rest, I don't have time to give the guy an interview. And so this is when Samuel Eliot Morrison begins to go, oh, too busy for me, the Harvard Don that's been assigned to write the history of the Navy in World War II, right? So the Navy goes out and hires a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian from Harvard whose expertise is in the sexual relationships of Puritans with each other, okay? That's Morrison's bailiwick, but he can write naval history. And his first contact with Fletcher is Fletcher won't meet him because he wants to take a nap, all right? So that pisses Morrison off. Don't piss those. So there's Nimitz's instructions to Fletcher. They haven't changed. He's going to be in charge of 3 aircraft carriers supporting the invasion of Guadalcanal. The problem with Guadalcanal is it's not here in the wide blue. It's close to land. The threats close to land are submarines, land-based aircraft, all right? And Fletcher and Nimitz talked about this, and Nimitz said, you know, you've got all the aircraft carriers in the Pacific Fleet. We don't need them getting sunk at this point, or otherwise our gambit here at Guadalcanal is going to be messed up. Ironically, Fletcher's biggest defender for this operation is going to be this Marine colonel who, right after the war and during the war, that he thinks Fletcher's decisions were a correct one. Long story short, Fletcher sails in to protect the invasion fleet. The invasion fleet actually manages to land peacefully at Guadalcanal and overrun the airfield there. The problem is nobody does anything to get the airfield ready for the land-based air. The key thing here is we're going to flow those airplanes in as soon as we can, the Marine Air, and stand up this air base, and then we'll have an air base that can't be sunk by submarines or by airplanes that can fight the Japanese, all right? Fletcher says, hey, I'm only going to have enough gas because of these high-speed anti-submarine patrols by my destroyers for my aircraft carriers. He understands the seamanship requirements, and he's having problems again getting enough gas in his destroyers, and he sends out the message, hey, the night of 8 August, I'm going to leave. I'm going to pull back, right? And so at nighttime, when carrier aircraft don't fly in World War II, the Japanese have a surface force come down the slot. The guy who's supposed to pick him up is John McCain, the senior McCain. John McCain the first slew McCain. He doesn't pick him up. Nobody picks him up, all right? And again, Fletcher doesn't pick him up. He doesn't have radar, and his airplanes don't have radar, so why send him out there to look for, to have mid-airs in the dark? So the Japanese conduct this Battle of Savo Island, which is the worst defeat of the Pacific War to that point for the Americans, where you get all these cruisers that get sunk, okay? I've talked about all this, so I'm going to go to the next one because I've kind of talked about that, and maybe we can talk about some of that in the thing. But it's a very, very confused fight. But this is when people start to say, oh, Fletcher. And he earns a new enemy here. He earns the enmity of Major General Vandergrift commanding the Marine Division ashore. Because Fletcher had said at the meeting, hey, if I run into problems, I'm not going to risk the carriers. I'll cover you through the first day of the invasion, but then I got to pull back and refuel my guys. The other thing that John Lundstrom makes clear in his book is Fletcher expected a carrier-on-carrier fight. He did not think that he would have to deal with surface warfare, a high-speed surface warfare run down the slot, and he didn't think he was going to have to deal with that. So he expected the Japanese carriers. So his real concern was that he would sort of get the triple whammy from submarines, Japanese aircraft carriers, and Japanese land-based air. He does provide air cover that first day. They do shoot down quite a few Japanese medium bombers, the Betty bombers belonging to the Navy, and he does do that, all right? But he does pull his guys back. But he had told Vandergrift that at the planning meeting, and now Vandergrift is like this. The other guy who kind of rats him out, who also leaves but never gets blamed for it, is Richmond Kelly Turner, the commander of the landing force. And Turner says, well, he turned tail and ran. The problem is, what are you going to do? By the time everybody knows what has happened, Admiral Mikawa, the Japanese admiral with his surface forces, is 400 miles away. American carrier aircraft have a range of about 225 to 250 miles. If that, unless you're going to send a kamikaze strike. And if you send a kamikaze strike, they probably still won't find the enemy because he's still going 25 knots, you're going 150, 200 knots, he's going to outrun you, and you're still going to run. So you can't even get these guys with a kamikaze attack. So all the criticisms of why didn't Fletcher launch an attack right after Savo Island, why didn't he turn around? And he's not criticized by Nimitz at the time, all right? The next and final battle for Fletcher is the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, all right? Let me kind of go back to the map so you can see where that battle is. And this is around Guadalcanal. Now he does get his carrier battle, all right? He gets a carrier battle. Let me kind of do this and take us to a map. We need a map in the worst way. In that battle, Fletcher is also in command. So evidently, he didn't screw up enough at Guadalcanal for anybody to relieve him. He's still in command 3 weeks later when the Japanese take every carrier they've got and come south. The Ryujo, the Zuikaku, the Shokaku. They almost had a fourth carrier, too, the Junyo. And they come south into this area, which is called Torpedo Junction, because this is where all the American aircraft carriers are going to get torpedoed after Fletcher leaves, right? And so they come down here, and this is the Eastern Solomons. They fight this very confused battle, and the Americans sink a Japanese aircraft carrier. Now, do they damage some of the U.S. aircraft carriers? Yes, they do. But the U.S. aircraft carriers are back online relatively quickly, where the Japanese aircraft carrier isn't. The other problem, too, is a lot of Japanese planes are shot down. But the Japanese think they've sunk 2 U.S. aircraft carriers when they've only really damaged 1, all right? And so that goes down as a victory, too. So we've got victory at Coral Sea, victory at Midway, and victory at the Eastern Solomons, all right? There's only 5 of these big carrier battles in the Pacific War, okay? There's the Philippine Sea, and the other one is actually going to occur after Fletcher leaves at the Battle of Santa Cruz, all right? Where another aircraft carrier, American aircraft carrier, the Hornet, will be sunk. Not on Fletcher's watch, by the way. All right. So what happens to him? Well, he's on the Saratoga, getting ready for another Japanese attack, when the Saratoga is torpedoed by a Japanese submarine. The aircraft carrier is lifted out of the water. Fletcher goes up, hits his head on the thing, starts to bleed all over the place. There's damage. He calls the captain up, bleeding all over the place. Corman's trying to patch him up, and he's like, no, no, no. And he's telling the guy, here's what you have to do to keep the carrier afloat. You need to counterflood here and here. So his light command touch has kind of gone away for a little bit because he wants to make sure he doesn't have another carrier sink because he knows the U.S. only has 3 left in the Pacific. So he takes that carrier, and they radio him and say, come back to Pearl Harbor on the Saratoga. Shortly after Fletcher leaves, the Wasp is actually sunk by a torpedo, and her commanding officer is actually court-martialed and fired for that. So, there's a lot of people getting fired and cashiered. So this is not a good time to be in command. When he gets back, McCain is also recalled, because McCain has also been getting bad report cards. But Nimitz trusts McCain, and he goes, what should we do with Jack Fletcher? And he goes, well, he's getting kind of tired. He's been at sea for 9 months. So initially, Fletcher leaves command, not because he's fired, because they want to give him a rest. That 3 weeks is critical, though, because it's during that time that King weighs in and says, hey, this guy's past his prime. He's not up to speed anymore. He's a bad luck admiral. He's only winning every naval battle he fights. So let's relieve him, okay? And it's amazing how poorly he's treated. By this time, the Marine Corps, Kelly Turner, and even his old friend Nimitz are sending cables to Washington saying, we're not so sure about this guy. When he finally gets to the District of Columbia, he's still on leave, nobody even wants to talk to him. I mean, here's the guy in command at Coral Sea, Midway, and the Eastern Solomons, and in command of all these carrier operations in the South Pacific. Nobody wants to talk to him or debrief him or get a debrief, all right? So the word is already out that, hey, this is not the hero we want. Let's get another hero, all right? And so he's assigned to the 13th Naval District, which is sort of in the northwest of the United States. In 1943, he goes to Nimitz and says, hey, I want to serve again. And Nimitz goes, you're too senior. You're a vice admiral. He's a 3-star admiral at this point. And gets promoted to 3-star admiral after Midway. Sounds like maybe that was a reward. So he says to Nimitz, hey, if it's my rank, I'm only temporary rank. 3-star admiral was only temporary back then, folks. It should be temporary today, but that's another thing. So 3-star admiral was a temporary thing. So Fletcher says, hey, put me back to my permanent grade of rear admiral and then send me to command somewhere. I don't care what I command. Just put me out there. Use me. But Nimitz declines to do that. And then later on in late 1943, he is called back to active command in the North Pacific. He relieves his former subordinate, Thomas Kincaid, in command of the Northern Pacific. And he spends the rest of the war essentially commanding the northern flank. He's in command during the Aleutians, or during the later parts of the Aleutians operation. And then eventually he takes charge of the Lend-Lease that's going to give the Russians equipment to invade Japan. Something called, I think it's Goalpost, if I remember correctly. So anyway, Fletcher ends up in command of that, and then he's going to actually come back into the big picture as part of the overall invasion of command in Operation Coronet, the invasion of Honshu. So he's actually rehabilitated to some degree, all right? However, the damage has been done. These are his enemies. Samuel Eliot Morison almost immediately begins to weave into his narrative in his publications after the war in the 40s and the early 50s, Fletcher is a cautious, cowardly man. Nobody challenges this. Nobody steps up to defend Fletcher. Not his old friend Ray Spruance, not his sometime boss Chester Nimitz. They all let it happen. Morison is spurred on by this guy, one of the most acerbic guys in Navy history, sort of your classic screamer, Richmond Kelly Turner, all right? Even the Marines don't like him, but the Marines and Turner agree on one thing: they hate Jack Fletcher. The Marines dislike him. They've got this myth that the Navy abandoned us at Guadalcanal, including this guy, all right? All right, despite the fact that the Navy loses something on the order of 4,500 people killed and drowned, where the Marines lose something on the order of 1,000 people killed during the campaign. But the guy to blame for the Navy leaving us is Fletcher. Fletcher becomes the fall guy for this narrative of the Navy abandoning the Marines and them losing the campaign of Guadalcanal. Oh, excuse me, I forgot, they won. Okay, so this guy, he writes him off. And again, I think with King, it's a jealousy thing. He'd been jealous of this guy. He's not flashy. He's a nice guy. He doesn't criticize people. There's a guy who used to live here in Lawrence, Archie Mills. Archie was at the Battle of Midway, and then Archie flew PBYs in the Guadalcanal campaign. So I was doing an oral history interview of Archie, and Archie pulled out this box full of photos and stuff from his time in Guadalcanal campaign. And he's going through these pictures, showing me these pictures, and he's like 90, "Hey, John, look at this, And here's this picture of Jack Fletcher, relaxed with his hands in his pockets like a good naval officer, right? In his whites, smiling. He looks totally relaxed, and I go, "That's Jack Fletcher." He goes, "Yeah, that's the Admiral." And I go, "Well, where was that?" He goes, "I think it was in Noumea at some sort of social event with the French." And I'm like, what did you think of Fletcher? He goes, "Oh, we loved that guy. He was a nice old guy." So these guys, and then this guy, after the war, Captain Richard Bates, eventually Admiral Richard Bates, takes over the Battle Analysis Division of the Naval War College. And Bates weaves into the Battle Analysis of the Naval War College and works with Morrison to create this alternative narrative of Fletcher being either too risky or too cautious. At Coral Sea, he criticizes him for being too risky. At Midway, he criticizes him, and Guadalcanal, he criticizes him. So Bates puts together these battle analyses, and nobody ever kind of calls him on it. He kind of gets away with it, all right? The upshot is a new narrative is created by the Marine Corps, by Bates, and by Morrison, that Fletcher is a cautious, always refueling his destroyer admiral. He wasn't really in command at Midway. He didn't really win at the Coral Sea. The Japanese thought they won at the Eastern Solomons, so they must have won, right? And so you create this narrative that, let's forget about this guy. Fletcher's defenders, there won't be any. For the longest time, Morrison's narrative, the Marine Corps narrative, is going to stay in place unchallenged, and it will be received by young sailors and young Marines until about 20 years ago, when John Lundstrom started looking at the Pacific campaigns really closely, and he said this: he wins his battles, but he lost the war in the court of history. I'll read that if you're hard of reading. "For it is the habit of mankind to entrust to careless hope what they long for, and to use sovereign reason to thrust aside what they do not desire." Questions? Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
What exactly, I know it's a little bit off true, but Rochefort, the intel guy, how accurate is that he had a big role in the Midway operation?
Oh, Rochefort has a very, very big role. You got to remember, Rochefort is under a cloud himself. Rochefort, like Fletcher, is forgotten. And it's not until Gordon Prang's work that Rochefort sort of gets resurrected. For years and years and years, Rochefort is... Another thing is, of course, the intel that Rochefort provides isn't declassified until the 70s, all right? So it's communications intelligence, and it's not declassified until the 70s. So, but Rochefort Rochefort's shop, Hypo, Station Hypo, is doing wonderful work. The problem is they haven't broken the Japanese code yet, right? And the Japanese are really good at radio silence operations. Now, that'll bite them in places like Midway, where they really need to turn the radios on and talk to each other, all right? And say, hey, we got a bad situation here. Maybe we should pull back a couple hundred miles and kind of figure things out before we continue this plan, right? So Rochefort is sort of under a cloud after Pearl Harbor. He does give indications and warning and sort of earns Nimitz's trust, particularly at the Coral Sea, where his guys say, we think the Japanese are going to attack Moresby first. We've got these codes that represent these key Japanese operations, but we're not sure which is which. But our assessment of the traffic analysis is they're going to go after Port Moresby first. And that's when Nimitz goes, all right, I'm going to launch everything I have. I can't use the Enterprise and the Hornet because I've tied them up in this risky raid on Japan, but I can send the Lexington and the Yorktown down there with Jack Fletcher. Old, reliable, right? And so Rochefort sort of earns his way back into the good graces of Nimitz. And by the time we get to Midway, Nimitz really trusts. But even so, I mean, Nimitz is kind of waffling about the call. And it's not until the Midway garrison sends a signal in the clear saying, hey, we're short on water, that they break the key code that the Japanese are using for Midway. And they go, hey, code group da-da-da-da-da-da-da is running low on water. And then the decision gets made. But actually, Rochefort has to kind of go the extra mile there, and they have to do that deception operation to make the Japanese do that. But yeah, Rochefort's intel is key. That's the thing about the Battle of Midway, folks. It's really a group effort. It's not just Fletcher winning the battle. You know, it's like Trafalgar. It's not just Nelson winning the battle. He's killed in the first 30 minutes, all right? Okay, so these things are often team efforts, but normally you give the team captain a little credit. Yes, sir, Tom.
Yeah, how's Halsey interact with Fletcher and Guadalcanal?
Yeah, there's a lot more. So how does Halsey interact with all this? And actually, William Halsey, is actually he's got his partisans, right? But he actually gets along with Fletcher fine. He knows Fletcher is his competition, right? He'd love to be in command at Midway, not Fletcher. He's an air guy. Fletcher isn't. But Halsey's okay. The one time that Fletcher is under his command in the South Pacific, this is before Halsey takes command, a couple months after Fletcher leaves Guadalcanal. When Halsey's in command down there, some things happen where Halsey gets the credit and Fletcher's guys don't get the credit, but it's extremely minor, and Lundstrom kind of explains everything. But yeah, Halsey and Fletcher kind of got along, but did he go to bat for Fletcher? No. In fact, Fletcher sort of becomes persona non grata by 1943. It's really odd, and you really have to read Lundstrom's book to kind of get a feel for it, but you feel sorry for the guy. You're like, this poor guy. You know, he goes out and wins all these battles, and then nobody will give him any credit for it. Not only that, they sort of turn him into this pariah because of this narrative that's coming back from Guadalcanal that he abandoned the Marines. And then you ask Samuel Eliot Morrison, he goes, oh yeah, he's a coward. And then you ask Richmond Kelly Turner, oh yeah, he's a coward. But Halsey's not on the anti-Fletcher team, but there's nobody on the pro-Fletcher team. And Fletcher isn't even fighting for himself. You know, he's not giving newspaper interviews why I should be the hero of Midway instead of Ray Spruance, right? So that's part of the dynamic. Yep. Anyone else? Yes, Gary, fellow Navy veteran.
What was the extent of connections between Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the Fletcher family? Was there any effect there on Fletcher's career?
That's a good question. You know, the initial object of FDR's ire and rage is going to be husband Kimmel. All right, but yeah, FDR and Frank Knox, the Secretary of the Navy, have no problems firing people before they get all the facts. They do that with Richardson. Richardson is really a civil-military relations dispute. I mean, Richardson says this is a bad idea. FDR says, well, we're going to do it, and then Richards continues to grumble about it publicly, and so he's removed. Okay, and so you might think that FDR would say, well, who are the Richardson guys out there? I need to keep an eye on them, but he doesn't do that. He does the same thing with Pye. He's got King. He trusts King, right? So I think if FDR ever thought about Fletcher at all, he would have asked King about it. And by the time we get to the Guadalcanal campaign, Fletcher has lost King's confidence. He really has. Deserved or not, he's lost it. And once you lose the boss's confidence, you've lost it. Guys like King and Franklin Roosevelt, they never give it back. You know, Franklin Roosevelt is not Abe Lincoln. He doesn't say, well, I've got something useful for you to do over here, okay? He basically says, okay, fine, Ernie, whatever you say. Guy's a loser. I won't use him anymore. The fascinating thing is Nimitz actually resurrects Fletcher. If there is a defender for Fletcher, it's Nimitz. But Nimitz is worried too much about King kind of saying, well, you know, you've got guys like Fletcher that you're in support of. I'm going to take some of your power. So there's bureaucratic infighting going on between the Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Fleet, which is an organization, and the Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet and their leaders. So there's bureaucratic infighting going on in here. Nimitz would like King to stay out of his knickers as much as possible, but King can't help himself. Now, you might think that I don't like Ernie King. Actually, I think he's one of the great strategists of the 20th century in the United States, but he's not a friendly person. He's not a happy person. I mean, King has three problems, okay? Alcohol, all right, cursing, and other men's wives, although he does restrict himself to Army wives and not Navy wives. So King is not a likable person, all right? He really isn't, but he's a brilliant strategist. But he is a micromanager, and Fletcher is almost 180 his opposite in terms of temperament and leadership style as an organizational or institutional leader, and so that rubs him the wrong way. Did I answer your question, Gary?
Well, I was just thinking, back, what was Franklin Delano Roosevelt some years before he became president?
Oh yeah, he was Assistant Secretary of the Navy.
Right.
You know,
Just wondering, even at that time.
Fletcher was just a junior commander by the end of World War I, and he wasn't on FDR's scope. And he's not on FDR's scope at all. And then when Spruance gets the credit for Midway, and that begins pretty quickly. In fact, I'd have to go into Lundstrom again, but it might actually have to do with the press coverage. There's sort of a press blackout on Midway that takes place because we don't want them to realize that we've broken the codes. Who's my code guy? So there's kind of a press. And initially, the Army is given credit for sinking the Japanese carriers with level bombing when they didn't. Yeah, they did make them jink and jank around, which had some impact, but no. So FDR is not really aware of Fletcher. But what's fascinating is he never brings this guy into the. Neither he or Knox bring him in to do anything. Oh, by the way, you reminded me of something with Fletcher. So yeah, he's not on their radar scope, and he never is. Okay, and that's odd. Why is that? You would think the guy in command at Coral Sea, Midway, and Eastern Solomons might have a little office call with at least the Secretary of the Navy when he gets back. Some of this is Frank Knox. He is an obsequious, patronizing, butt kisser for FDR. He really is. He's a good Secretary of the Navy, but he's also tells FDR what he wants to hear, likes the people that FDR likes, and he's not really that interested in, he kind of defers to King when judging the competence. The only time that he doesn't defer to King is Pye, where he says, that guy he's gone, he's a loser, But other than that, he defers to King. His successor, James Forrestal, maybe it would have been different. Now, Forrestal does become the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. But again, I think by the time Forrestal really starts to wield some power inside the Navy Department, Fletcher's already a has-been by that point. He's a has-been. After 1943, Jack Fletcher is a has-been, even though he ends up in operational command before the war ends. So what about the cut to the head? So after the cut to the head is bandaged and everything, Fletcher kind of gets back to business and he takes the Saratoga back to Pearl. The corpsman who treats Fletcher puts him in for a Purple Heart. He is the highest ranking officer in the U.S. Navy at that point in the war to get a Purple Heart. He never put himself in for it, but the corpsman went, well, I treated so-and-so, here's my report, and so Fletcher actually gets a Purple Heart in the mail during his leave period when he's wounded on the Saratoga. Yeah, Tom.
Actually, it occurred to me to wonder if the Ernie King's alcoholism led him to the Army wives, or if the Army wives drove him to the alcoholism. But that's
you'll have to ask Mark Clark's wife that question, because he came on to her at a party one time. But go ahead.
That's really not my question. Fletcher is involved in these complicated and unprecedented battles. There's no collective experience with this before, and he does amazingly well in these complex situations at Coral Sea and Midway and Eastern Solomons. But the question is, did he have with him the same talented junior staff each time making all this happen, or is he alone?
And that's the great thing about Lundstrom's book. He does. He has some very, very talented people who work with him. in this time period, particularly his flag lieutenant is an aviator. Eventually, he will sort of make, not Butch O'Hare, who's the guy? Oh, yeah, Thatch. Jimmy Thatch, who eventually will sort of become right-hand man to McCain. He utilizes Jimmy Thatch. So he does have a very talented junior staff that's working with him. But he also relies heavily on the other staff officers for the organizations that are horizontal to him and also subordinate to him. So he's really good at that, and Lundstrom brings that out in the book. But again, it's staff relationships and everything, and people go to sleep listening to it on audiobook. But they're very, very important, so you make a very good... He's got pretty much the same team the whole time. And when he loses a guy, he's very sorry to see them go. He's like, oh man, how am I going to replace this particular guy? Yeah. So yeah, he does have a very talented, but it's not a very big staff. I mean, we're talking about 7 guys as the admiral's staff, plus maybe 1 or 2 radio operators for these extremely complex, widespread, far-flung operations with, and in every case, of course, the 2 battle fleets are out of sight of each other. Yeah. Good question. Good. Yeah. What else? Yes, sir. Well, I think the more that we study history, the more we sort of find these unsung heroes, these forgotten generals, forgotten admirals. And so I'm going to use an Army example now. Fletcher is the Navy's version of Jake Devers. Okay? Who's Jake Devers? What the heck? You know, who's Jake Devers? Well, he's an Army group commander. The United States has only like 4 Army group commanders in World War II, and one of them is Jake Devers. Jake Devers is not self-serving. He doesn't cuss. He doesn't cheat on his wife. He's good to his soldiers. He supports his subordinates. He's competent, but he's not self-serving, and he doesn't write memoirs, and he doesn't, like, Fletcher lives for a long time after the war. I mean, he dies like in the 1970s. And Devers, the same thing is true with Devers. So it'd be interesting to write sort of an article comparing the 2 guys and kind of comparing that. And Devers has got his own book that's come out recently that finally gives Devers all the credit that he could. Devers almost ended up being Eisenhower. The difference is Devers probably would have never run for president. You never know. I mean, you can never really know about these things. But yeah, it does happen. And there's other guys waiting to be discovered. The key, what's going on here, folks, is people capture the narrative. All right? The narrative gets captured. It gets sunk into people's brains. Ray Spruance commanded at Midway. Everybody knows that. Well, everybody's wrong. All right? Nick Roger, who I think he's at Oxford in England, is a history professor at Oxford, either Oxford or Cambridge, I forget which. Nick Roger says this. He says, the problem is not that we don't know enough history. The problem is we know too much, and most of it's wrong. Questions? I love this. I live for this. Yeah, Tom.
Yeah, and Wolkowitz, when he talks about the slot campaigns, Savile Island stuff.
Who?
I think it's Wolkowitz. He's the Navy historian.
Okay.
He wrote, I think it was Desron 6.
Okay.
He says that the newer destroyers that were there had radar, but they're put at the rear of the column because the admirals didn't understand what radar could do.
Who was responsible for that disposition?
Yeah, and is that McCain then and his folks?
No, not McCain. Okay, so
Or, yeah, and did his
so
staff learn from that? I
Yeah,
guess
so Fletcher is in overall command, but in command of the invasion task force is Turner, and in command of the screening force is a British naval officer. All right, and then under him in command of the task group of the Blue, which is the destroyer with the radar at Savile Island, and then the cruisers there. The senior guy of the cruiser commanders, and I think it's the captain of the Chicago, is the commander. All right, but he's actually under this, and nobody knew how to use radar at that point effectively. It was sort of this gee whiz thing, and nobody expected the Japanese to do what they did, which was as soon as they found out Guadalcanal had been invaded, no radio circuits, no radio traffic, no Joe Rochefort, right, to intercept it, because Rochefort's already been relieved and sent on to a better assignment, commanding a floating dry dock, all right? I knew I'd get my floating dry docks in there, all right? And this is regarded as a movement up, that a unrestricted naval officer, unrestricted line naval officer, would go on to command one of these strategic assets, of which there are only 4 in the United States Navy at this time. So Rochefort is not there. So Mikawa goes radio silent down the slot, surprises everybody, uses classic Japanese night tactics. You know, what are they doing it with? They're doing it with eyeballs and searchlights, all right? And so the enemy gets a vote. You know, sometimes the enemy gets a good one in. You know, Pearl Harbor, you know, they probably didn't deserve to do as well as they did there. But certainly, but Mikawa, he screws up too. He sinks all these ships, turns around and goes home. He could have sank the entire half of the invasion fleet that was still there. And then I think Fletcher would have really been roasted. Because then, but the surface warships were thought, they were the protection. Everybody thought they would protect the transport fleet and the supply ship fleet that was still there. Only half of it was still there. The rest of them had already offloaded and left, all right? And then Turner left the next day, but nobody, well, the Marines do accuse Turner of leaving them high and dry, but then once they get Fletcher, they go, well, this guy's even better target, okay? Because we got to work with Turner for the rest of the war, but we don't have to work with Fletcher, so we'll make Fletcher the fall guy, and they do, okay? But the Marine Corps guy who's doing the analysis at the time for the Marine Corps in the Pacific, and Lundstrom talks about him, he actually gives Fletcher the pass. He says Fletcher made the right strategic decision, okay? Tactically and operationally, you know, he could have stayed, but strategically he probably made the right decision, because if the U.S. loses these aircraft carriers at this point in the war, are we going to be able to maintain the Marines in Guadalcanal? By the time we get to the end of October, no aircraft carriers left, okay? They're all gone. Okay, they're either damaged or on the bottom of the Pacific, all right? So it's a bloody campaign. Most of those carriers are sunk after Fletcher leaves. In fact, all of them are sunk after Fletcher leaves. Enterprise is damaged. Saratoga's damaged when he's on it, so it's already damaged. And then Wasp and Hornet are both sunk. Hornet's sunk by air attack, and Wasp is sunk by a submarine at Torpedo Junction. Did I answer your question? Yeah. Okay. I probably answered a couple more, too. Anything else? Yes, ma'am.
I just happened to be reading again Herman Wouk's The Winds of War,
yes,
and War and Remembrance, and I don't know enough of the detail, but several things you're mentioning sound familiar. And
yeah, no, that's a wonderful book. And again, the guy they're following, Pug, is the guy that Wouk based that guy on sort of a composite of a couple guys, right? A composite of a couple guys, but the guy that they're really kind of looking at there, I think, is more of a one of the 2 admirals that gets killed at the night battle of Guadalcanal, which is Callahan and Scott. Navy loses 2 admirals in the Guadalcanal campaign that get killed in one battle in one night. All right, and they die gloriously though, and they turn back the Japanese fleet enough so that the aviators can mop it up the next day. But yeah, I think he does that. I'd have to go back and read the pertinent sections to see what he brings into it about Fletcher. Again, I read that book, or those books, I don't know. Yeah, in the 70s, like I was in college. So, and I wasn't one of these guys looking for people to badmouth Fletcher back. Now I'm attuned to it. Whenever anybody badmouths him, I challenge them and say, well, what about this? What about this? What about this? And sometimes people win their arguments with me. Could he have done a better job refueling his destroyers off Guadalcanal? Well, you can always do a better job. Could he have picked a better spot to refuel them at? Well, I don't know. We know now. We know things now that he didn't know then. That's a big problem with us folks. We're all post facto. We have this sort of 20/20 hindsight, particularly with the Pacific War, where now we really kind of know where everybody was and what they were doing. But the problem is they don't know. We didn't know how many Japanese submarines there really were. The assumption was there's a lot of Japanese submarines in these waters. There was the assumption that, hey, when we invade Guadalcanal, the Japanese are going to attack us with aircraft carriers. Well, we'd done a good job at Midway, all right? So the Japanese aircraft carrier fleet was trying to reconstitute itself. We really picked kind of the right time to invade Guadalcanal. The timing on it was superb. And the guy who should get credit for that, Ernie King. All right, everybody told him he was crazy. And he goes, well, we own the Marines, and so we can do it without your approval, George Marshall. And he did. And Marshall was presented with a fait accompli. all right? It did suck resources from the European theater, but we didn't have the amphibious lift to do any invasions in the European theater beyond North Africa anyway, so it wasn't that big of a deal. All right. Yeah, I've got a lot of arguments about the Pacific War versus the European War. Okay. They were both important. Thank you for your service. Right. Okay. What else? Well, thanks much. And I'll tell Frank, Jack Fletcher, that applause was for him. Thank you very much.